I'm Liz Gabriel, the Adult Program Coordinator for the Lewisboro Library. Thank you for joining us today to hear Thomas Dunne, who is a retired FDNY Deputy Fire Chief, who was on the job for 33 years. Tom is the author of Notes from the Fireground, Memoir of a New York Firefighter, which is about his years with the department and being on the front line of tragedies like Hurricane Sandy and the World Trade Center terrorist attack. His book is available to purchase on popular online sites like Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or directly from the publisher, which is McFarland Books. Welcome, Tom.
Thanks, Liz. Good afternoon. First of all, my thanks to you and to the Lewisboro Library for inviting me to share some time with you this afternoon and talk about the book. My thanks to everyone who happens to be on Zoom right now as a participant or as an observer. And in particular, let me thank literally my oldest friend on the planet, Howard Seaman, who I noticed just now is also watching in. Howard, it's so great to see you. Yeah, Notes from the Fireground. As Liz pointed out, I was not born an author. I am a retired New York City Fire Department chief, and I had the desire after retirement to keep active and keep productive. And one of the many things I wanted to do was to get more into writing, which led to this book. So what I'd like to do over the next 45 minutes or so is kind of review some aspects of the book, some of the things I went through in producing the book, and perhaps give some insights to those of you who are not firefighters about what it's like to be working in parts of New York City and what it's like to be a firefighter. So if we can continue here. Okay, briefly my background. As Liz pointed out, I'm a retired firefighter. I've been retired now for about 7 years. Grew up in New York City, in Brooklyn in particular. I grew up basically looking over the East River at this. Manhattan was the background. It was sort of an out there type of place that occasionally we would get to go to on the subway or whatever. But this person here in particular was a tremendous influence on me. This is my dad, Francis Dunne. This is a picture of him when he was in the service in the Army in World War II. A tremendous influence on my life, as I pointed out in the book. I did dedicate the book to him. Quite honestly, I probably never would have become a New York City firefighter if it was not for him, because he himself did about 30 years on the job. It's a book not only about firefighting. I didn't want to write a book just about firefighting. I wanted to write about life in the city. All right, I wanted to write about development, about change, about how you evolve whatever area you live in, whatever you do for a living, from a person like this as me at 3 with my dad in the background, to a person 60 years later, let's say, or 50 years later, functioning as an incident commander at a major fire, in this case in the Bronx. It's about growth, it's about change, it's about experiences that we all go through in our lives, whoever we are and whatever we particularly do for a living. Why become a firefighter? Well, I'd like to tell you that it was a childhood dream. It's something I always wanted to do, but that is absolutely not the case. I followed for the most part, the traditional growing up experience of going to high school, going to college, worked a couple of so-called professional jobs for a while, got quite bored by them, and wanted to do something different and challenging, something kind of off the scale. My initial intention was to do this job for 1 year, just to get the experience to know what it was like, and then to move on to something else in my life. And what happened was I wound up doing it for 33 years. It became a tremendous experience, a tremendous influence on my life and the person that I became. Why did I write the book? Well, you can see here sort of the 3 major reasons why I did it. It was a challenge. I wanted to tell a story of how my life changed and evolved over time. I wanted certainly to talk about, illustrate a specific slice of life. Most people have not been, fortunately, in a burning building. Most people are not at all familiar with the intricacies of firefighting in general, or with the specifics of the New York City Fire Department. But maybe more than anything, I wanted to air out some feelings, things that built up over the years, things that I thought about, things that impressed me about things I experienced in the city and on the job, just to kind of express some of the good and negative feelings I felt after 33 years, after decades of doing this work. Right. For example, there are images that are seared in my mind of places and things I saw and did. For example, this particular image here, a fire in the top floor frame building in the Bronx. I've experienced this both from the perspective you're seeing now of the chief in the street who's running this operation, and from the individual firefighter working on the roof who's cutting that hole open to allow the fire and the smoke to escape from the building. And I can tell you from both perspectives, it was challenging, and I almost felt it was more difficult being the supervisor in the street, being the person responsible for the well-being of the people up there. Okay, images like this showing up in the middle of the night, in this case in Queens, and seeing a fully involved church fire. And then there's these sort of inner experiences, the underbelly of New York City that I got to experience quite a bit in my career, my profession. This is a typical tenement stairway. This one happens to be also in the Bronx. It's not radically different from the tenement stairway that I grew up in Brooklyn. And Howard, who I know is watching, who grew up in the Bronx, probably has a similar stairway in his building there. The difference being that my stairway in Brooklyn was clean, it was safe. We didn't have to worry about drug addiction or shootings or things of that nature. As I worked in the Bronx and other sections of the city, I got to see what that was like. I got to understand that not everybody's life or living condition was as comfortable as mine. That if an apartment house like this had, let's say, 15 or 20 families living, all of them, or 99.9% of them, were decent, hardworking people, but inevitably there was that one drug dealer or someone who would mess things up. So we got to see sort of the underbelly, the dangerous and seedy underbelly of New York City. And of course, you couldn't do my job in the period I did it in without experiencing and being influenced by 9/11. It's to a certain extent the defining moment for the FDNY as well as New York City. And again, there were so many images, so many thoughts, so many sad things that you experienced down there that I wanted to also incorporate in the book. All right, so the beginning of my career. All right, this is the training facility in Reynolds Island, New York City, for the New York City Fire Department. This is the smokehouse, and you can see from the photo on the right, there are some dark shutters with some smoke stains coming out. The FDNY, like most fire departments, is a quasi-military institution. And I came in as a definitely unquasi-military type of guy. I was a bit of a free spirit. It was not an easy experience for me to line up, to be marched, to be yelled at, all the things that you would experience in sort of a military type environment. And yet there was a reason for it. Firefighting, working on the fireground, is very much like a combat situation where you have to instantly know what to do. You have to instantly react. You have to understand and accept the chain of command. And obviously you have to be prepared physically for this type of work, which is what the smokehouse was all about. And I have a chapter in the book where I talk about first experiences in a smokehouse where they subjected you to breathing in smoke, getting you to really start to gag on it, but at the same time to realize that you can deal with a certain amount of smoke, that if you lose your air supply, that you're not necessarily going to die. But it was a difficult 6 weeks for me. The training has been expanded now to 6 months, but the very beginning of the job was somewhat of a culture shock and a physical shock to me, because I was, again, this college graduate who had worked in offices and did traditional jobs. So it was a bit of a difficult start for me. There's a very deep historical and somewhat hidden culture in the firehouse, in the fire departments. And of the firefighters that are watching today, even if you're from Westchester County or Long Island or California, wherever you're from, I think we all share a similar culture. This is the typical firehouse kitchen, bunch of guys sitting around talking. We firefighters have strong opinions on everything, okay? It's a very generally male, tough, alpha male type of atmosphere. There have been efforts through the years to recruit women, and there are a number of women in the FDNY and other departments. They're still very much a minority. So it is a largely male-dominated, tough blue-collar culture. Again, even though my dad had done this work for 30 years, it was not an easy transition for me. All right. I've always been somewhat cerebral. You know, I'm not a big beer drinker. I didn't have a lot of the characteristics that the guys I worked with, that worked for, had. Yet over time, I managed to meet some incredible people in the fire service. The men who broke me into this job, I came into the job in 1981, were veterans of the so-called war years, which was that period from the late 60s through the 70s, where every night the Bronx and Brooklyn was on fire. And these veterans would go to 10, 11, 12 structural fires a night. And they were a tough group of guys, but they were great guys to learn under and to work with. And it really expanded my appreciation of culture. You know, I grew up in Brooklyn. I've lived in a comfortable suburb for many years. And again, being a firefighter, I got to see how the hidden stories in New York City, how some people live, and see how some people work outside of the traditional office or professional atmosphere. Life as a firefighter, you know, I could list a lot of things. These are three things that come to mind. It's a very exhausting job. It's very hands-on. It's a very sensual job. All right. Like most of you out there, I dealt largely with images in my previous jobs, office work, concepts, that type of thing. This is what very hands-on. It was a transition from being a cerebral worker in, let's say, the digital world to a hands-on worker in a very dangerous physical world. A lot of that did appeal to me. I found that the physical aspect of the job certainly gave a slant to the work that I had not experienced before. And also with this, I could have listed several other bullet points. It turned out to be a very satisfying and rewarding type of job. So life as a firefighter included a lot of things. You got to see and hear things. For example, middle of the night, this is an example of pulling up to a building somewhere. The doors are locked. You have to get in. There's a smoke condition or a fire or whatever going on the other side of that door. And visually, you can see they're using a forcible entry saw to cut locks. It is extremely loud, but to see that sort of firework effect in the middle of the night is kind of appealing, you know, despite the fact that you're working hard and you're a bit nervous and uncertain of what might be on the other side of that door. Again, it was a very hands-on, physical, almost sensual type of work. All right, this is the top of an aerial ladder. A typical aerial ladder might be 75 to 100 feet in height. If you have to climb up there to get into a window, it is a physical experience. It's a very challenging experience. As you climb up that ladder, it's designed to actually move a little bit. And the reason for that is if they put it on top of a windowsill, they want your body weight to push that ladder down onto the windowsill so that it stabilizes the ladder and you can step into the window more easily. Again, it was something you had to grow into, you had to get comfortable with, you had to learn how to deal with that and turn off your discomfort and fear. For example, I remember climbing to the top of one of these ladders when I worked in mid-Manhattan as a firefighter. I was assigned to get to the top of the ladder, get into a window, which was not really a big deal because I didn't have much fear of heights, fortunately. But I distinctly and clearly remember as I held my right hand onto the top rung of the ladder and swung my leg upwards to get into the window, for a split second, I looked at the tendons in my wrist. And I realized for that 1/100th of a second that The only thing that was keeping me from falling 10 stories from the tip of this ladder was my rather thin wrist with the tendons that were attaching the hand to the rungs of the ladder. And I instantly had to turn it off, because in this type of work, you couldn't think of things like that. You had to develop a mental and emotional discipline to do physically challenging things, to do physically dangerous things. Again, very hands-on, very sensual, very challenging type of work. Very dirty work. All right. Again, I dedicated a whole chapter in the book. I call it a discourse on dirt, on how you would have to deal with not only the physical discomfort, the physical exhaustion, but essentially it was a physically dirty type of job. You dealt with soot, you dealt with remnants of smoke and water and steam. Sometimes you would go into a hoarder type occupancy, and you would open up the door and you might have garbage and things going almost up to the ceiling. The individual hoarder occupancies that people just collected things forever, which obviously led to bugs and rats and things of that nature. The ultimate acceptance of dirt I found was at the Trade Center site, where firefighters who had worked there for weeks and weeks and weeks on end, digging up dirt and soil, became so insensitive to their surroundings, because they were always surrounded by dirt and dust and toxins, that I used to see them pick up little remnants like a rag or something and smell it. And what they were doing, much like a dog would do, is to smell if it had any scent of a human, a deceased body. You just got used to it. Again, it was the opposite extreme of working in a clean, fluorescently lit office building, which was generally my previous type of work experience. Very traditional job. What's more traditional than a pole, a sliding pole? I remember, since my dad was a firefighter, sliding at the age of 10 in his firehouse. And then, 50 years later, I was still sliding, in my case, and then I finished up in the Bronx for the past 15, 16 years or more, and I was still sliding at that age, traditional of the sliding pole. A job with tremendous history. History and tradition. That's one of the things I wanted to kind of stress throughout the book. For example, here we have what is referred to as the company journal. It's just in this case, an old book from 1913, a hardcover book. And this is a book that would be in every firehouse. Just about everything of significance that occurs in the firehouse is written down in this book by the person who sits up front, the guard or so-called house watchman. It's a type of book that probably you could have seen Charles Dickens write in 200 years ago. It really hasn't changed a heck of a lot. And one of the times I was working in Manhattan, I actually uncovered this. I was working overtime in an engine company, I believe it was on 26th Street. And one of the things I like to do, since I'm sort of an amateur hands-on historian and like the historical aspects of the work I was doing, I would go up to old lofts and uncover old lockers that hadn't been opened in decades. And if you open these things up or got up in an old loft, if you sifted your way through the dust, you would find books that have been like this, that have been filed away, in some cases for decades or longer than that. I hit the home run of old books this particular day. You can see this is a page from that particular company journal, August 1873. And this impressed me so much. I connected with this so much that I wanted to incorporate it in the book, and I did include it in one of the chapters. Here you see David McBride is taking over the house watch desk on this August 11th, 1873. And I didn't expect to find something like this. I almost felt an instant connection to this particular firefighter, because here I was working over a century later, uncovering a book, uncovering a page that he actually wrote it that long ago. And it was like going back in history. If you think about that particular date, 1873, the FDNY had only existed for 8 years at that point. David McBride, who wrote those entries, probably was a Civil War veteran. Ulysses S. Grant was the president. There was no Brooklyn Bridge yet. And it kind of gives you a connection with the past, hands-on, that I just kind of stumbled upon. I found inside the page, this particular page, a piece of silver foil that was actually a wrapper for tobacco that I guess David McBride was smoking in his pipe over 100 years ago. Just then a run came in. We had to respond to something in mid-Manhattan, and I couldn't take the book because that's their property, but I carefully folded up that particular piece of foil, stuck it in my pocket, slid down that pole, and took that run in. And I thought there was kind of a neat poetic justice to the fact that here was a tobacco wrapper that hadn't been looked at in a century, and a century later was going on a run. So it's a job with great history and great traditions. The writing process. This is an author talk, so I have to say a few words about the process of writing. And I understand that there probably are people out there watching this now who are writers or have written, have published things, may very well be far more accomplished or better writers than I am. But maybe the fact that I'm a relatively newly published writer gives you a little bit different slant on the writing process if it's something that you've contemplated doing. My brief writing background, if you will, started with magazine articles. I had the opportunity to write magazine articles for about 20 years. I enjoyed it, but they were always like 2,000 to 4,000 words. I would knock them off. I'd get paid a moderate amount for them. In the back of my head, I always had sort of an idea for a book, and that's what led to Notes from the Fireground. Went through several different concepts of the book. I originally thought of it as producing a textbook that might have interesting backstories about the concepts of firefighting. And the more I thought about it, the more I worked on it, the more I realized, no, I wanted to do something completely different, something a bit more creative. I didn't want to write a textbook or a technical type of book. And I wound up writing what essentially was a memoir, sharing a lot of personal experiences about my life and on the Fireground. If you've written, as I know some of you have, if you're thinking of writing, it is a very humbling process, okay? Don't quit your day job, as they say, because it's very difficult to get published. You're gonna face rejection. I had to contact a lot of agencies before I finally got someone to agree to publish. But if you have the discipline, I felt that if you had something inside of you you really wanted to say, and you had the discipline to sit down regularly and work on this thing and formulate this thing, you can be successful depending on your idea of success. If you want to be a New York Times bestseller, again, don't hold your breath. That's highly unlikely. But if you want to produce something written in a book or magazine article or whatever that you feel is significant, that's coming from your memory, from your heart, from your soul, if you will, stay with it, because you will definitely be able to produce to some effect, a successfully written manuscript, which can often be sent out, published by someone, hopefully, perhaps self-published. I found I grew as a writer just as I grew as a person and a firefighter over the years with the FDNY. It got to a point where I knew I could produce a book. I did publish in this case, a nonfiction, a memoir. I spent a lot of time at home in the last year and a half continuing my writing, and got to a point where I just recently signed a contract for A Moment in Time, which is a novel that I expect to have published later this winter. So hopefully we'll have a chance maybe sometime next year to talk about that one. But that was kind of the writing process for me. There were often days when I felt like this lady here, frustrated, uncertain of what to do or where to go. Again, it's the discipline that got me through it. Okay, but going back to the FDNY, typically in any fire department, if you want to move up, these are the ranks that you go through. You start off as a firefighter, which is the hands-on aspect of the job, doing the actual firefighting. First step, first promotion is generally the company officer, which is lieutenant or captain. Then there's a large step to chief. Initially, it's a battalion chief, a guy who runs first chief at the fire. He typically run about 60 personnel. Eventually, the deputy chief, this is the guy who is on top of the operation when it really starts to expand, when you get to a multiple arm type of operation. So lieutenant, company officer is the first step. And I made that first step in 1987 after I had 6 years on the job. Okay, I became a company officer. In this step, in this particular case, you can see the first rank is lieutenant, Fire Department of New York. As I say, I had 6 years on the job, which is not a heck of a lot of time. Typically, a lot of company officers have had 10, 15, maybe 20 years on the job. So here I was placed in a position of leadership, okay, made a manager, in many instances having to supervise men who had far more background than I did. So it was a little intimidating at first. I most definitely was not ready for this first step, okay? I had to grow into the rank of lieutenant, just as I had to grow into the next rank of captain and eventually a chief officer, which was a huge challenge and a huge step in terms of responsibility. All right, so I become the boss. I'm not ready. Fortunately, most of the firefighters I worked for were extremely helpful. Right, they would see me as the new green promoted lieutenant, the new company officer, who was a nice guy but really didn't know what he was doing. And my hat's off to all those old veterans who guided me, who helped me, who were so helpful in assisting me to grow into a company officer who basically became a confident person, a confident company officer, and a so-called leader of men. In addition to being a supervisor for the first time, my work environment also changed dramatically when I became a company officer. This was sort of the type of background that I was used to working in when I worked in Mid-Manhattan. I was a firefighter in a Mid-Manhattan company. This is Lower Manhattan, but this is kind of the environment I worked in. When I became a company officer, 1987, I was assigned to the Bronx. 1987, this is kind of what the Bronx was still like. It was a tough borough. There was still a fair amount of fire activity up there. It was a different atmosphere, both in the community and the physical setting, but also within the firehouses themselves. These were companies in the North and South Bronx that had worked and lived through, again, those so-called war years of the 60s and 70s, where there was just a tremendous amount of fire activity. And I was thrown into this. I had a pretty good fire background, but I didn't have their type of fire background. I didn't have a lot of tenement work, which was a lot of what was going on in the Bronx. And I had to acclimate myself to a different type of firefighter up there, a different type of environment to work in. It was a very dangerous environment there was still a lot of drugs and shootings and such going on. And at the same time, I'm transitioning from, just a guy who's responsible for himself to a person who's responsible, in this case, for 4 or 5 firefighters who work for my company. And I have to make decisions that affect their well-being. So it was a challenge and a big jump at the same time. I get into 2 fires in particular in somewhat depth. I dedicated a chapter to 2 fires that are most memorable for me. Happy Land Social Club in 1990, which is this, and a job in West Harlem that I had as a captain, which is this type of building. Just briefly to talk about this, March of 1990, exactly 79 years to the date since the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, historic fire in Lower Manhattan, where so many poor immigrant young women died. To the date, March of 1990, the Happy Land Social Club fire, which is in the Bronx, 87 people die. Very strange experience for me. I drove to work maybe 3 days before that fire to a fire company that was just blocks away from this. And I distinctly remember stopping at a stoplight as I was driving and just kind of gazing around, and I saw the sign you see here for the Happy Lands Social Club fire, and didn't think much of it other than it looked like a sad place. You have the little smiley face, but it was a tough neighborhood, not exactly an appealing place to have an event, but it was a social point for people in the neighborhood. About 72 hours later, I'm going into that same building late in the night, actually early in the morning, assigned to a ladder company in the Bronx, basically to bag bodies, largely of young people. And I remember it being the eeriest experience in my life of seeing all these people that it's almost as if they just fell asleep. You know, they were hit by a blast of smoke and hot air from the floor below. And I get into chain of events in this particular chapter about this, because if you recall, there was one man in particular who started this fire on purpose. He was angry at his girlfriend who worked in the club. And he shows up with a gallon of gasoline, dumps it in the front door, lights it up. 87 people die. And I can't help but think, well, what if he had just waited? What if he had just punched the wall or done something, done anything other than what he did? None of this would have happened. And all of these young people that died and have been long gone would be walking around today, maybe with families of their own. And ironically, the woman who was his girlfriend that he was so angry at survived this fire. But I get a dedicated chapter to this because it's such a travesty for the people in the club, for the people in the Bronx, and such an unforgettable experience. A few years later, I'm working in Upper Holland, the west side of Manhattan, and it's a different engine company. I'm there for doing a couple of weeks vacation spot, covering their captain. He was on vacation, so I was assigned here for a while. And we come into a building very much like this, that was a tough building, had previous fires, was not in good shape. I remember leading my men into the first floor, stretching a hose line to try to knock down this fire, and looking up the stairway. And all you could see was almost like a Hollywood movie. It was floor upon floor of fire, and things were falling down on us. And for a split second, I thought, geez, we probably shouldn't be here. We can't put this fire out. Just as I was thinking that, the battalion chief, who was in the street observing and running this operation, shows up and gets on the radio and says, I want all members out of the building. And I thought, oh, thank God, because I was thinking the exact same thing. Now it's official, he wants us out. Just as he says that, and we start turning to move away to a side exit from the building starts to collapse around us, a major collapse. And I remember I describe it in the book as, they describe things as sounding like a freight train. It's exactly what it sounded like. And in 1 minute, we have pretty clear visibility, and a split second later, it's just darkness. The most frightening thing in my career, maybe the most frightening thing I experienced in my life, but that's not the point. The point I remember from this, and the point I tried to bring up in this chapter, was this closeness, this brotherhood that you experience in the fire service and in the FDNY. And I imagine in other types of work, such as police work and things of that nature, where instantaneously things go bad and you have to depend on each other. And I remember reaching back for one of my firefighters in the darkness. I kind of knew where he was, but I wasn't sure. And I reached back and he was there. And I wrapped my arm around him. And he did the same thing to me, And rather than the two of us just bailing out of this building, each of us took that split second to overcome the strong instinct just to get the heck out and escape, and rather than just jump out, to reach out for each other. And I remember clearly walking out of that building, out of the rubble, the remnant of that building, arm in arm with this guy to the backyard where it was perfectly clear. And it just crystallized to me so much what the essence of this job is. All right. There were times when the job could be boring. There were times when the job could be frustrating. But when you experience moments like that, all right, these intimate, frightening moments where you were alone, but you weren't alone. Okay. The person next to you reached out for you just in the way you reached out for them. There's a sharing there that, if you haven't been through something like that, is a little hard to share with someone else. But it's something I just wanted to bring up in the chapter, and hopefully I did it in a way that you can relate to. Okay, Chief. So again, that way of going up in the fire service, start as a firefighter, all right, become a company officer if you choose to get promoted, lieutenant, captain. You wind up being a chief if you want to study hard, if you want to assume a lot more responsibility and actually run fires from the street, as I am doing here, rather than being the person inside the building who's done that. You have to have been a firefighter and a company officer. You have to have experienced that inside knowledge and firsthand knowledge of what it's like to be in a burning building to be a good chief. But about 17 years into the job, through a lot of study and a lot of perseverance, I got lucky enough to become a chief. Again, one of the biggest jumps you can make in a firefighter's career, because your entire perspective of an emergency operation is different. Your entire level of responsibility is different. As a firefighter, you're responsible for yourself. As a company officer, you're responsible for 4 or 5 men who are assigned to your unit. As a chief, you can be responsible for anywhere from 60 to 160 people. And the decisions you make, good or bad, are going to affect the well-being of those people, not to mention the success of the operation. So I had to learn a whole different perspective of firefighting. I had to learn to appear like I was not stressed and I was relaxed and I was under control, almost like this golfer here. I never quite achieved that level of relaxation at a fire, but this is what I had to project as I was supervising a fire operation. Because if the guy in charge, if myself, sounds nervous or sounds incompetent, how is that going to reflect on the people who are working inside that building doing the really dangerous work? So I had to develop all new types of skills and perspectives, right? There were certainly new stresses involved. And I grew over the years. I started off as a battalion chief. I was a chief together, maybe about 20 years altogether. Eventually became a deputy chief, which is, again, the top rank in the field where you're truly in charge of the entire operation. The book is not only about firefighting, it's about change. It's about how I changed, how I, in fact, had to change from the person I was who started doing this work to the person I evolved into as I did this work for several decades. And that leads me to one of the chapters. I don't like to read too much directly from a book, because I think that can be kind of boring, but there's one brief paragraph I do want to read from the book, from the chapter called The Why. And to set it up, in this particular chapter, I contrast an experience I had in Brooklyn as a brand new battalion chief with an experience I had as a very experienced deputy chief 20 years later in the Bronx. In both cases, they were fires that involved the fatality of a middle-aged man whose body was discovered lying in a small bathroom in the apartment. In the first fire in Brooklyn, it turned out that the body I uncovered, ran across, had actually started the fire in his own apartment. He wanted to collect insurance. 20 years later, as a deputy chief, much more experienced firefighter, I go to a very similar type apartment in the Bronx. Again, a man of very similar physical characteristics, of the same age, lying in the same position, deceased, in a bathroom, in the same type of situation, flashing back one to the other. And when I go down to the street in the Bronx, I'm continuing to supervise the operation, be outside. The man's wife comes up to me and asks about her husband. And here I'm really put in a position I've never been in before. I've just seen the man's body. I know he's deceased. His wife is standing right next to me in the street at the command post saying, "Where's my husband? Where's my husband?" I didn't know what to say to her. I knew that if I turned to her and said, "I'm sorry, your husband's dead," it would have been devastating. And I sensed that that's probably the worst way to handle this. And I lied. I said to her, "Ma'am, I'm sorry, I don't know. As soon as we find out something, we'll let you know." And part of that was I was pushing it off, I know, because I didn't want to address it right away, and thought perhaps there'd be someone at the scene who could more gently and more subtly tell her that her husband was dead. But that's kind of the background to this particular story, and not to read too much, but just to give you a sense of some of the things I try to talk about in this particular chapter, which is, again, expanding beyond this, some of the things I wanted to put into the book, not just talk about fires or collapses or things of that nature, but to talk about human nature, about the things that I experienced, I'm sure things that you have experienced. Okay, nearly 20 years separated the Brooklyn and Bronx fires, but they had a lot in common. The men who died were about the same age and were similar in appearance, and each had wives who were nervously pacing in the nearby streets. The big difference is that one of them was in the process of trying to improve the home he lived in, while the other was trying to destroy his home for profit. And the other difference was me. I was not the same incident commander in Brooklyn that I was in the Bronx, nor was I the same individual. 20 years of this work had made me a good chief, and by necessity, a different person. But I wonder if in the process of becoming that person, I had lost something, and if a hardening of the emotions is just as much of a job hazard as a hardening of the arteries. Again, change, development, things that we all experience, wanted to kind of incorporate it into the book. Okay, we'll move on, and we talked about the why. I become a deputy chief. Again, this is the top of the line in the field. You're running an entire operation. I'm on my own, because if something bad happens, it's going to be a pretty long time before someone comes from headquarters and is able to come and help me at the scene. Okay, I have to step up and I have to lead. I have to learn to organize. Okay, I have to de-stress, not only myself, but the people at the scene. Again, I talked about this earlier. I try to illustrate this with a couple of brief Fireground audios to kind of tell you what it was like, or just highlight what it was like. I had to be a pretty good actor to be a good chief officer, to be a good incident commander. In particular, to be a good deputy chief, who's the guy who has battalion chiefs and people, a lot of people working underneath him. If I showed signs of nervousness, all right, if my voice didn't come across as calm and reassuring, like, all right, we're starting to get a handle on this, it would set a bad tone for the operation. It would make my people nervous. And yet here I am running an operation, that could be very dangerous, realizing that the decisions I make could hurt a lot of people if they're bad decisions. I'm feeling all this inside at the same time, making a conscious effort to act like I was not feeling that. Okay, I had to learn to improvise. You seldom had everything on the scene go right. There were instances like this where you had to just do what you had to do to get a water supply. Okay, setting the tone. It was so big as a deputy chief. This is the slide I wanted to have you listen to two brief audios. And those of you who are firefighters probably have heard similar type of radio transmissions. Generally, when things are going well, the radio transmissions on a fireground are pretty calm and pretty clear. It's only when it starts hitting the fan and bad stuff happens that loss of control starts to happen, when the quality of the communication diminishes rapidly. And just to illustrate this particular, this is not the building, but it's very similar to a fire I had in the Bronx. A very cold day, it's winter, it's about 7 degrees. This fire in the first building to the left, it starts in the first floor, works its way up to the second floor, eventually blows out of that rear window over that 1-story extension that you see on the right. And that's called, as we play these particular audios, you'll hear that referred to as exposure 3. Exposure 3 basically is just the fire department's way of saying it's the rear of the building. And what had happened here is there's a firefighter standing in the street roughly where those people are below here. And he's observing this. And before that flame, before that big ball of fire shoots out, he observes that one of our firefighters is working on that roof. And then he sees this ball of flame come out, and he doesn't know if the guy's still there. All right, he gives a mayday. Very upsetting thing to see. And you can tell from the tone of his voice, if we can listen to this, how upset he is projecting this particular message.
Where are you? I'm okay. You got a member operating an exposure 3 sign. You got no means of egress. No means of egress. Get that fucking AC. Is that ain't too old? Is everybody off the roof? SWAT the roof. Get up.
Okay, you can hear that disruptive type of communication, people stepping on each other, everyone's saying something, but you can hear the distress in that firefighter's voice when he's saying, I don't know if there's someone up on that roof. I'm standing in front of that building running this operation, which is stressful enough to begin with. Then I get from him a very upsetting message, which is the worst thing any chief can hear at a Fireground, which is that it's Mayday, one of your members is in trouble. One of your members is in big trouble. So what do? Well, I got to ignore the fact that my blood pressure is through the roof, right? And what I make is a conscious effort to try to respond in as calm a way as possible, which is what I try to do here.
Are you okay? 610 to command. I'm okay. I observed a member on exposure 3 site, 2nd floor. No means of egress. He was there, and now he's trying to firefighter up on 3 side. I do not know where he went, man. All right, command has the member given a mayday been removed from the building tag? 2-0.
Okay, so here I am.
5-1 to 2-0.
Getting the worst
Go ahead, 5-4.
message possible.
What? He's got a line up on this roof.
You can hear in the background of the radio a lot of yelling and screaming going on, and I'm taking a deep breath, and my message is hopefully as calmly as possible. Is the member giving the mayday, has he been removed from the building? All right. Fortunately, he was. He had stepped off of that setback before the fire blew out, and I found that out pretty quickly. But despite the fact that that was so upsetting to hear, I had to force myself, again, as the leader, as the deputy chief, whatever, I had to act. All right. There was a bit of acting. I'm not the most calm person on the planet or the most courageous person on the planet. I'm a fairly good actor, and it helped me quite a bit through this job. All right, dealing with the media, and we have another 10 minutes or so. Then if anyone has comments or questions, certainly we welcome to you. Especially when I was working in Mid-Manhattan as a chief officer, I had to learn to deal with the media, and most of them were gems. Most of them were very easy to work with, very good to work with. At the same time, I had to develop, not having been trained in this particular aspect of the work, I had to kind of learn on my own what I could say and what I should not say. All right, I kind of thought of it as the art of developing the art of talking and saying nothing. And that was particularly important if there were issues with that particular job, if there were injuries, if people were dead, or if there were questions of who might be involved in responsibility. You had to be aware of the fact that everything was recorded. Everything and anything you said could wind up in a court of law. And you were always kind of walking a fine line between wanting to be open to people and inform the public, and knowing where to draw the line, knowing when it's inappropriate to talk about certain things. And again, by far the majority of the reporters I worked with were decent people, treated us very well. Once in a long while, I did have to deal with a reporter or two that was particularly too aggressive, but that was not the case. Again, the Midtown, if someone sneezed, it seemed like NBC and CBS and everybody else was right in their face. Not the same up in the Bronx, which had a lot more fire activity. But the response in the outer boroughs from the media was not as intense, not as quick as you got in Manhattan. So it was kind of another aspect of my job that I had to develop. And it was kind of interesting because I would often come home from work, and if it was a good fire, especially in Manhattan, I could watch the 6 o'clock news and kind of evaluate my performance as the person being interviewed. Did I seem confident? Did I say the right things? Did I tell them too much? Did I tell them too little? I kind of evaluated how I performed. Of course, 9/11, I'm one of those fortunate individuals who was not there at the time of the collapse. I was working in the Bronx. It took me several hours to get dispatched down to the city, but certainly there are images and thoughts and memories of 9/11 that we all carry, and certainly I carry. I touch on in the book my 9/11 experience is always kind of related to a phone conversation I had with a friend in July of 2001, just a few weeks before 9/11 happened, which is certainly something none of us could have envisioned happening at that time. And if you look back and think back to 9/11, 2001, there's a fire that occurred on Father's Day that sadly is almost forgotten because so much bad stuff happened since then. And in Father's Day in 2001, there was a fire in a hardware store in Queens where there was an explosion. Unfortunately, 3 of our firefighters died. And I'm sitting in my office in Mid-Manhattan. I'm a chief at this point. And I get a phone call from a friend of mine who's working nearby. He's a battalion chief working in a nearby battalion. We had been friends for a while. We worked together and fought fires in the Bronx. And we would talk about things periodically. Inevitably, our conversation touched on the Father's Day fire, which was just a few months prior to that, a few weeks prior to that. And I clearly remember my friend's quote, and he said, "Tom, there, but for the grace of God, go you or I." And we both knew exactly what he was saying, that it was just fate. It was just circumstance that led to those firefighters being in that position and being killed at that particular fire. And that was my last conversation with him. And I couldn't have known it at the time, but just a few weeks later, he's one of the firefighters who died on 9/11. And again, I touch on this in the book. It's something that is deeply embedded in the psyche of New York City, of those who've experienced it, whether you're a civilian or emergency responder, it doesn't matter. It was just a trauma for all of us to go through. Okay, but again, the book is about change. All right. In my particular case, the changes I went through as an individual, as a person, the growth I went through. This is a picture of my training class in the academy in 1981. This guy right here is me. All right. And if you could have told me at that point in 1981, well, you're going to do 33 years of this job and you're eventually going to become a chief. And you're going to see stuff like this, and the city's going to be attacked, and skyscrapers downtown are going to fall over. I wouldn't have believed it. All right. But I look back on this picture and think, geez, how green I was, how naive I was, and how fortunate I was to have done this job for so long. And to still be here today, alive and healthy, able to talk to you, write a book. I carry a lot for this job. And just a few more finishing comments here. One of the positive things is I keep talking about how I learned to function under stress, how I learned to communicate calmly under stress, how I learned to be a leader. You know, I was always kind of the quiet guy in the past who would be in the back following the rules or the discussion or whatever had to be done. I had to learn over the years to step up, despite whatever nervous feeling I had, despite whatever insecurity I might be feeling. I had to be the guy to step up and say, this is the way we're going to do it. I'm going to communicate it to you. This is what I expect of you. And if it doesn't work, we'll go to plan B, that type of mentality. And something like that makes you a lot more confident. I'm sure you've all gone through experiences like that in your lives and your work experiences. I was able to carry over that confidence to write the book, to write the next book that's coming out, the novel, and to get out, as I've done for a number of years now, on the circuit to talk to both civilian communities and to emergency responders about my experiences in the FDNY, about my experiences in the city, and draw out lessons from them, from those experiences that I can share with others. And it doesn't matter if you are a corporate executive, a hedge fund dealer, or whatever you do for a living, or a firefighter. There are things that I think I can draw out of and have drawn out of my background that made me a fuller, more confident type of person. And this is some of the stuff I try to bring out in my lectures. At the same time, the job has influenced me in a way that I don't think I can ever look at the world the same way I did before I became a firefighter all those decades ago. If I am in Manhattan, I can't help but look at that construction crane and imagine, well, what would it be like if that crane collapsed? All right, I can't go past the building in parts of the Bronx and not look at a tenement and think, geez, I hope they're safe. I could just imagine what a fire in that building was like. And I think this is kind of becomes part of who you are, regardless of where you've been a firefighter. It doesn't matter whether it's from Chicago, New York, Somers, Albany, New York, or down south. This is stuff that kind of gets incorporated into your essence if you've been a firefighter. Last slide before we break and take any questions or comments you happen to have, which you could forward through, I think, Liz, our moderator today. I don't think anyone can do this type of work for any period of time without wondering this question, why me? Right? I don't think you can deal with life and death situations. I don't think you can really deal with scenarios like a firefighter or a police officer deals with, and not think some of the bigger existential questions in life. What is it all about? You know, what is this life essence that we see and enjoy in ourselves and others? And when it's just cut off because people are injured, people are burnt, people are in a collapsed building, what is it all about? Is there something beyond the immediate here? Is something beyond our day-to-day lives? Is there a philosophy, a religion, a belief, an approach to life that can guide us through the confusions that definitely are out there? There's a little bit of, I guess you'd call survivor guilt. You know, I went through 33 years of FDNY work. I spent months down at the Trade Center site, and I was remarkably lucky, not only in my career, but subsequent to it. And that's not because I was a better firefighter or better chief or better person. It was just circumstance. You know, you can't help but wonder, why me? You know, why did my friend or so many of my friends get ill or die on the job? And you realize there's no answers, but it does kind of lead to those existential questions of what life is all about and what your role in that life should be. If you have comments or questions, I do have a website, right? The best way to get in touch with me is through the website here. If you happen to be interested in the book, I told Liz, our librarian, that I was a pretty good firefighter, okay? A fairly good lecturer and a really bad salesman. So, but if you happen to be interested in the book, it's available through Amazon. McFarland is the publishing company. I think if you get it through Amazon, it's cheaper because you don't have to pay for the shipping. But if you do have any comments or questions or things you want to bring up, perhaps experiences you have, at this point, you can, I imagine, go through Chris or Liz, our moderator, or if you want to directly contact me, again, www.chieftomdunne.com is my website, and certainly we'll get back to you with any comments or questions or complaints you may have. So again, to those of you who participated and listened in, and to Lewisboro Library, thank you so much for allowing me to share my book and some of my experiences with you. And Liz, if anyone has any comments or questions at this point, I certainly will be here as long as you want me to talk about them. And thanks so much for listening in.
Thank you so much, Tom. And like from the very top, first thing that someone said was thank you for your service. So I'm sure everyone on here wants to thank you for your service.
Appreciate it.
And
Thanks
you know, mostly it's comments from people saying thank you for sharing your experiences and giving insights into the life of a firefighter and how appreciative we are for your service. But if people want to, I've unmuted everyone. If people want to ask questions, they can go right ahead.
Or like I said, if people want to text in questions or if they have questions about to me directly, this is probably the best way to get in touch with me. But if there's anyone out there who has a comment or question, by all means, feel free to step up now.
I actually wanted to ask you, and I had it written down before you even showed the slides of the company journals because I saw it in your book. And so are they still using journals or is it computerized now?
No, I'm sure there's a huge database in the FDNY of everything that happens. everything that's done essentially is done backed up by digital if it's of significance, injury reports, purchases, things of that nature. But each firehouse does have a large book like that. There's a little desk area at the front of each firehouse where there's always a firefighter seated, and he has a little desk and he has that book in front of him. And his job essentially, while he performs the house watch function for about 3 hours, is to answer the phones, monitor the computer, which is the way they get the responses from the dispatcher. And he has to record in that journal in a pen, a black or a red pen, anything of significance that happens. For example, they leave quarters for fire inspection duty, or they leave quarters for a fire or a run. Those are still there. In fact, there are fire buffs out there who collect these books. And certainly the older they are, the more important they are. Okay, and one like I had one for 1913 would be pretty expensive, I would think, at a lot of the buff conventions where they like to buy historic firefighting items like that. But yeah, that book is very much still in existence. I'm fortunate I have a couple of old ones. I have one my father actually used, I dug up from the 70s. And my most prized possession, again, is that page from 1873, which is like a whole different world. And it was so interesting for me to see that written in that beautiful 19th century script that they had back then.
We do have a few questions in the chat now. Someone was saying they were curious if you had kept in touch with the firefighter that you hugged inside the building that was about to collapse.
I did not. You know, I would like to say we became lifelong friends. We didn't. And the major reason, probably at the time, I was what they call a covering officer. A covering officer, I was newly promoted to the rank of captain, and I was not yet actually assigned to any one particular unit, which meant that I had to travel throughout the city. In this particular case, it was an engine company in Harlem. And I was really there for a very short period of time, which was good in a way that it exposed me to different parts of New York City. But the downside to that was I was only there very briefly, and I didn't get to know the individuals extremely well. So that also put you in a position where you are frequently working with hundreds and hundreds of firefighters over the course of your experience as a company officer, but you were in and out very quickly in a lot of places. So no, that was probably the last fire I had in that company, and just a day or two afterwards, I was reassigned to some other fire company somewhere else in the city. I'd like to think that he went on to a very healthy and happy career, and maybe I hope he, on some level, remembers our experience together, because I remember clearly hugging him and walking out with him. I do have some interesting, you often see generations going into this line of work. And I have had, toward the end of my career, had experiences working with firefighters whose fathers I knew. And the most interesting one was, as a firefighter in Mid-Manhattan, I was involved in a rescue operation with a firefighter who had passed out on the top floor of a large tenement building from the smoke, a really difficult fire operation. And I remember going down the scuttle and helping tie him up to a rope, and they pulled him up to the roof, resuscitated him, saved his life. About 25 years go by, and I'm now a chief up in the Bronx, and I have a similar difficult fire at a Bronx tenement. And there's a firefighter, one of our firefighters goes to the top floor, and there's about 12 civilians, residents of the building, who have passed out because they can't get up out of the hallway because there's a locked gate that keeps them from escaping the building. This firefighter does a great job of going down, busting open that gate, and all those 12 civilians, those 12 residents get taken out. EMS treats them at the scene, and they'll survive. A remarkable job. The guy who broke that gate down and led to the rescue of all those people is the son of the guy that I was involved helping rescue 25 years earlier in that Manhattan tenement. So you kind of, there's kind of an ebb and flow to life, and you almost saw the same sort of ebb and flow in the fire department.
Wow. Okay, someone asked the question, have there been improvements made over the years for fireman to fireman communication during a fire?
Yes. When I came on the job, not everybody had a Fireground radio. That's the radio that's on a strap around your shoulder, and you can talk very easily into it if you have to communicate something important, or worst case scenario, if you get in trouble, you get trapped or something happens to you, you can just get on that radio and say you're in trouble, give the mayday. There's even a little orange button on that speaker that you can press that automatically transmits a piercing signal to everyone at the scene, indicating that we have a firefighter in trouble. Those communications have greatly increased. The chief's command board, the chief is standing in front of a building, and again, at a large fire, you might be supervising dozens of fire companies, maybe 150 or more firefighters. And initially, all we had was a metal board that your aide could kind of sketch out where the different locations were for your personnel. Now they have electronic boards that are able to pick up emergency signals from everyone at the scene. Every firefighter now has that radio, okay, everybody. So where I went by 30 years ago, go into a window by myself to search an apartment, I might very well do that by myself without that radio, okay? Since then, everyone has been given a radio, and they have the 2 in, 2 out concept where you constantly reinforced, which means that if you can no longer go in alone. You have to basically have someone helping you, even if it's just someone staying at that window, observing the fact that you're crawling into that apartment. So yeah, the face-to-face and electronic radio communication is significantly better than it was when I came on the job originally.
Yeah. Again, along with gear, someone asked, how much protection does the protective clothing actually provide?
Well, quite a bit. They use nowadays, for decades, they've been using bunker gear, which is an ensemble that has helmet, hood, coat, pants, boots. That's far more protective than the stuff that firefighters that we were using into the mid-1980s, which were basically roll-up rubber boots, a coat that wasn't quite as protective. They didn't really start introducing hoods that protected your ears and such until around the mid-80s, late 80s or so. So the gear is far more protective. On the other hand, there's maybe a little downside to that, in that firefighters now are so encapsulated by protective gear that they can no longer sense as easily as we could decades ago what exactly was going on around them. They used to teach you that if you're crawling in and you start feeling heat on your ears, maybe you're pushing it a little too far. Maybe you're getting too close to the fire, or maybe it's the heat starting to bank down too much. Now with the hood and such, all great protective gear that really keeps the burn percentage down significantly. At the same time, there's maybe perhaps more danger of getting too close to a fire or too close to an environment that might be damaging to you. But I would say overall, the protective stuff is better. Yeah, without a doubt. Firefighters culturally have also changed quite a bit from when I first started the job. It used to be a traditional meat and potatoes type of job. Not everybody, very few people actually worked out. Now, if you go to a firehouse, mostly every firehouse has weight room, exercise bikes. If you look at the kitchen meals, meals that would be laughed at 40 years ago are now somewhat routine. They're salads, they're fish. Firefighters are more well-rounded individuals. I think they might be more educated than they were, more professional in a lot of ways, because the challenge of being a firefighter is greater now than it was when I became a firefighter. A great deal of EMS work is involved. They're dealing with hazardous materials situations, not to mention the terrorist aspects. There's so much more to train for, to worry about, to deal with than traditionally firefighters were faced with.
Okay. Okay, this is, someone asked, what is the path to becoming an arson investigator?
Arson investigator is a promotional path in the FDNY. I can't speak for other departments, but typically you come on the job, you become a firefighter, and many, if not most men, stay at the rank of firefighter because they enjoy that aspect of the work. And I understand I like the physical aspect of the job. So many stay with it because they like being firefighters. Many others are not able to get promoted because they have side jobs. Plumbers and firefighters are very talented, hands-on people. A lot of plumbers, mechanics, carpenters. And to get promoted, you have to be in a position to dedicate a tremendous amount of time to reading and studying. There's a volume upon volume of things that you have to memorize in terms of firefighting procedures, building construction laws, administrative duties, things of that nature. So traditionally, the first test you can take is either to be a lieutenant, which is a company officer in a fire company. Some firefighters elect to take the test for fire marshal, which is the person who's actually a peace officer. He's issued a gun. He might actually be a police officer officially. They deal specifically with investigating the causes of fires and, when necessary, making arrests of arsonists. That too is a promotional test. It involves sitting down, reading a lot of different material, and it's a small percentage of the job in terms of the number who do it. But again, it's that promotional hurdle that's a challenge to get over, because you just don't show up and say, I want to be a marshal. You have to put a certain amount of effort into preparing for a promotional test and doing well enough on that test to get to a point where you're high enough on the list to be promoted. So that's generally the career path for that.
What's the, just because you were talking about this, and there is another question, but I just was wondering, what's the percentage of people who start the academy and make it all the way through?
I don't have that. It's probably changed through the years. I can't speak for it now. When I went, I would say it was close to 100%. All right, because it was. I had 300 people in my so-called probie class. That's the basic training class. I do not remember a single individual not getting through the 6 weeks, which is not to say that through the years, as the training has expanded, I believe that the basic training is months now, maybe as much as 6 months. At this point, it could be the number of people who have chosen to get out of the training has gone up due to the nature of the length of the training involved. So I would suspect that it's gone up since I was there. I can't really say a precise number, but I can say that it's such a competitive process getting to be a firefighter that whatever the percent is, it's very low. When I took the test, which would be the late 70s, I believe 27,000 people filed for the test. So you had to do very well in that written test. And then there was a physical competition involved, where you had to do very well in that. You had to be the upper echelons of the list to get the job. So for that reason, when I went through the training, it was virtually non-existent. As far as now, there probably are cases of people who decide, nah, this is not for me, but I statistically, unfortunately, I don't know what that would be.
Okay. And then lastly, someone's asking, in addition to your own book, what are some other firefighting books that you would recommend?
Well, it depends what you want. If you want technical books, and most books about firefighting are technical books that teach you how to be a firefighter, how to be a company officer, how to be a leader. There are unlimited number of books out there like that. There's a company called Fire Engineering that produces books of that nature. If one person in particular who's not related to me, there's a sort of the Babe Ruth of chiefs is a guy named Vinnie Dunne. He's not related to me, he spells his name differently, but almost anything he wrote or continues to write is excellent. He writes really good technical articles and technical books about firefighting. As far as if you want literature that is not technically oriented, but sort of like an easy read, There are a couple of memoirs out there. Certainly mine is there. I like to think it's an interesting book. There are probably a few other memoirs you can look up, firefighter memoirs that might be of interest. We just lost, probably a month or two ago, a fellow named Dennis Smith, who wrote a classic book years and years ago, a Report from Engine Company 82. And he's one of those firefighters who worked in the South Bronx during the war years when fires were happening so often. He wrote a number of novels. He was kind enough to give me a nice blurb on this book. I had an opportunity to speak to him not long before he passed away. And novels, Dennis Smith wrote a couple of firefighting novels. I mentioned, about a month ago, I signed a contract with a publisher for my next book, which is a novel. And I'm thinking it'll probably come out maybe sometime this winter. I'll post that on my website, sort of when that happens. And it's kind of the next step for me, having written many technical articles, now having written a memoir. I wanted to write a novel that incorporates the two things I know most, which is firefighting and New York City. And this is a novel about a New York City firefighter, but it's not just firefighting. I try to bring some other aspects and other twists to the story in it that hopefully will be of interest to people. But those are kind of the things I would mention or recommend. There's so much good technical stuff out there. Dennis Smith wrote some nice firefighting stuff too, and anything Dennis wrote is pretty good.
Okay, that is it for questions in the chat. Thank you so much, Tom. And I'm going to reach out to you, of course, when your novel comes out, so that hopefully we can do it in person program here. That would be great.
I'm sure we will. I'm sure we will. I certainly prefer that type of presentation, and hopefully this time next year we'll be able to sit down and meet directly and talk about that one. But again, thank you so much for allowing me to be part of this and to share my book and my background. And certainly, again, my thanks to everybody who happened to tune in to the Zoom today.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, everyone who's on here today. And we look forward to seeing you again.
Thanks so
All
much.
right. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye now.